Hey, shalom, 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 everybody. How y'all doing? How y'all doing? It's SHILO. Welcome back to Reading with SHILO. We're here to get it in tonight and finish off chapter 4. Chapter 4 of On the Real Side by Mel Watkins. We're going to be at it about a good hour or so. Tonight. A little over an hour, maybe. Looking at how I read last night, last chapter or last section of this chapter is it's going to take, hopefully not as long. I shouldn't be doing too much talking, but we'll see. We'll see how it's going to flow, how it's going to go. And hopefully we have a good show, good reading of section 3 of On the Real Side by Mel Watkins, a history of African American comedy from slavery to Chris Rock by Mel Watkins. By Mr. Mel Watkins. We're going to finish off chapter 4 tonight. Chapter 4, that is the plan and the objective. One page at a time, one section at a time, one chapter at a time. And then we can move on to chapter 5, Hollywood's Silent Years, The Curse of a Nation. Yeah. So we're moving right along. We are moving right along. Chapter 5 isn't that long. So, hey, we're going to see how far we can get, man. We're moving along. Look at that. Look at all that. Oh, yeah, I like seeing that, man, for real. I like seeing it. But let's go ahead and push through section 3. So come on in. Like, dislike, whichever. Leave a comment. That's a for sure. Do one of them or both of them free. Both of them free. Critique it, whatever. We're going to keep moving. We're going to keep pushing. Section 3 of chapter 4, Vaudeville and Black Humor. The comedy had surfaced in Black Road and tent shows, variety shows, vaudeville acts, and musical comedies during the 1890s and earlier 20th century was generally indistinguishable from the minstrel comedy that preceded it, at least with regard to its spoken component. Nearly all the eminent comics of the period began their careers in minstrelsy, and that training, combined with pressure from producers and mostly white audiences to stick with the familiar, undoubtedly dictated the verbal thrust of their humor. But a careful reading of descriptions of their work suggests that, despite the blackface makeup, splintered dialect, and ludicrous costumes, a subtle change was occurring. Ernest Hogan, Bob Cole, Flower Nee Miller, and Aubrey Lyles, and Bert Williams and George Walker, the leading Black comics of the time in varying degrees, seem to have added an almost imperceptible nuance to their acts, a distinctly Black physical style that set them apart from vaudeville's white minstrels and blackface imitators. Gradually, they began moving away from the antic, wildly exaggerated caricature of Black physical movement typical of white blackface acts to a less frantic form of bodily expressions that, while not losing its flair, was by comparison cooler and at the same time more realistically mirrored actual Black behavior. Not coincidentally, it was in the routines of Williams and Walker that this change was most dramatically seen. Unfortunately, only the routines of Williams and Flournoy Miller were filmed, and Williams' original routines are only available in two short vignettes, Fish and A Natural Born Gambler. Still, Williams' partner, George Walker, alluded to the emerging stylistic difference between black and white performers in a few years before his death in 1911. The one hope of the colored performer must be in making a radical departure from the old darky style, italics mind, of singing and dancing, he said. There is an artistic side to the black race, and if it could be properly developed on stage, I believe the theater going public would profit much by it. My idea was always to impersonate my race, just as they are. The colored man has never successfully taken off his own humorous characteristics, and the white impersonator often overdoes the matter. Despite Walker's reaffirmation of the old stereotype, blacks as natural humorists, his remarks pinpoint the physical style of black culture as a key ingredient in African American humor. Style, however, is an elusive concept. Some regard it simply as flair or embellishment, as in, say, the spectacular manner in which Julius Erving, Dr. J, or Michael Jordan have performed on the basketball court. But in fact, an austere, unadorned approach also represents a definite style, although not a highly esteemed one in black communities. For example, as a basketball player, Boston Celtic Larry Bird was not without style. The style he reflected was simply less consciously elegant. It was exemplary of the mainstream no frills attitude that, until the 1980s at least, typically decried excess and panic for its own sake. Conversely, in black communities, assertiveness, flamboyance, and grace are extolled. From Willie Mays' basket catches, Muhammad Ali's shuffle and ringside theatrics, and the swooping slam dunks of Dr. J and Michael Jordan, to Duke Ellington's cool, elegant understatement. Miles Davis' cantankerous aloofness, soul singer James Brown's earthy exuberance, or 90s rappers in your face guest, gesticulations. Black performers have usually displayed a practiced self assurance and stylishness that reflects the community's regard for high style. In black and white style and conflict, Thomas Kochman, or Kochman, defines style as an attitude that individuals within a culture express through their choice of cultural forms and the way they choose to express themselves within a form. Loosely, then, it is the external manifestation of the inner attitude that shapes what individuals do and how they do it. Moreover, it determines the manner in which they perform everything from such ordinary tasks as talking, walking, or eating to more elaborate endeavors such as athletics and the performing arts. Among most urban blacks, establishing a distinctive professional style was a certain part of their daily lives. The crippled stable groom from whom Thomas D. Rice appropriated his famous Jim Crow song and dance was working, not entertainment and not entertaining an audience. Then, as now, one's walk and rap, one's manner of moving and dressing often determine status in black communities. Black teenagers do not simply walk down the street, they move rhythmically, bopping, swaggering, strutting. Their stride is a signature, a syncopated choreography in which head, shoulders, and limbs work in fluid harmony with one another. As Kochman points out, black style is more self conscious, more expressive, more expansive, more colorful, more intense, more assertive, more aggressive, and more focused on the individual than is the style of the larger society in which blacks are a part. For black entertainers, the element of style was and remains even more important. In a community where practically everyone consciously cultivates flair in some form, any pretense to eminence requires that one demonstrate at least a minimal amount of individual flourish. Talent alone is usually not enough. That intangible element, stylistic flair, is demanded. It ain't what you do, it's the way you do it. It's not merely an old blues lyric, it is an axiom in the Black community. But minstrelsy established a parody of African American style. Black entertainers had to excise this comic exaggeration and restore grace and elegance. And that is precisely what Williams and Walker, and to some extent other Black entertainers, achieved during the early 20th century. Compare, for instance, Charles Dickens' description of the dancing of Juba Lane on page 109, with the description of Walker's cakewalk on pages 143 and 44. Despite his agility and the innovative nature of some of his steps, Lane, according to Dickens' report, moved with the same wild, frantic verve that characterized nearly all minstrel dance. Humor and ridicule was the desired effect. Therefore, Lane aimed at giving the impression of being out of control and looking foolish, even as he demonstrated the most difficult dance steps. Walker, on the other hand, was intent on displaying Black style even as he worked for laughs. His cakewalk is described in terms of airiness, jauntiness, and grace, despite the humorous intent. The effect, aside from Walker's individual talent, was due largely to the imposition of Black style onto the act. Few would argue that Walker was Lane's equal as a dancer, yet Walker had added an intangible quality of style and flourish that set his routine apart. In addition, Black comedians turned to their own folk roots to add another dimension to their stage humor. They clearly began investing their acts with motifs derived from the trickster tale that dominated slave humor. Not that the trickster theme was exclusive to Africans or African Americans. Occasionally, it was even used in minstrelsy when black-faced actors portraying illiterate Black characters were soon pontificating on weighty subjects such as politics or philosophy. But the traditional trickster theme, an essential ingredient in both the slaves, animal stories, and the John and old Massa tales, was usually avoided in minstrel humor. In minstrelsy, as we have seen, the black-faced trickster was both the vehicle for the humor and the butt of the joke. A new denigrative twist had been added. The black trickster, as portrayed by whites, did not demonstrate common sense and homespun wisdom to satire the pretenses of the elite as did the Yankee and frontier types. Instead, he was himself the object of derision. That is, the humor was derived from the trickster's untutored and uneagerly abortive attempts to understand or explain some platitude considered beyond his conception, or, more pointedly, to outsmart a presumed white character. The interchange between Morin and Mack on page 170, just coming up, is an example of the reversal of the trickster motif as used by whites in minstrel comedy. Around the turn of the century, however, Black comedians began portraying a type that more validly reflected the intent of traditional Black tricksters. Once recast in an image reflecting more authentic Black style and less blatant buffoonery and ineptitude, the stage dandy took on more traditional characteristics. Initially, however, the comic stage version seldom approached the pointed satire found in the Brer Rabbit stories and hardly ever reflected the cynicism and obvious disdain for white authority found in trickster folk tales. There were exceptions, such as Williams and Walker's Bandana Land, but Mainstream audiences would have to wait nearly half a century before that aspect of the black comic sensibility was fully unleashed in the routines of Red Fox, Moms Mabley, Dick Gregory, Wilson, and Richard Pryor. Instead, in the early appearances, the black stage trickster's adversary was usually another black character. Sometimes the schemes were successful, most often they failed, reflecting what folklorist Charles Joyner calls the trickster out tricked motif. Williams and Walker and Miller and Lyles introduced comedy acts based on the interactions between a conniving, unscrupulous, and fast talking trickster and his gullible, apparently slow witted friend. In their routines, the trickster's dandy scheme occasionally worked out so that the pair successfully duped an adversary. But since both comedy teams worked primarily before white audiences, most often the scheme backfired, and the trickster and his friend were discovered and reprimanded. Even more frequently, in an obvious turn on the trickster out tricked gambit, the trickster's attempt to inveigle his gullible sidekick backfired, and he was embarrassed or humiliated. If the leading of the leading comedians, Ernest Hogan altered his comic routine less than others. A venerable minstrel performer, Hogan often seemed more intent on exploiting the minstrel coon image than changing it. As a composer, he defended calling his most popular song All Coons Look Alike to Me until just before his death, when he admitted that he regretted the coon reference. Even though he moved from minstrelsy to road shows and finally to black musicals in vaudeville, his comic routines remained constantly mired in the Southern plantation buffoonery on which his popularity was often or originally established. Excuse me. Still, the Harlem Renaissance novelist Jesse Fawcett credits Hogan with a subtle alteration in minstrelsy stage Negro. Hogan changed the tradition of the merely funny, rather silly, man into a character with a definite plot in a rather loosely constructed but nonetheless well outlined story, she wrote in 1925. A little of the hard luck of the Negro began to creep in. If he was a buffoon, he was a buffoon wearing his rue. A slight, very slight quality of the harlequin began to attach to him. He was the clown making light of his troubles, but he was a wounded, a sorely beset clown. Perhaps, but if so, the transition was slight indeed. A bit in which he pantomimed eating a watermelon while slaving delight, while the band played Watermelon Time was featured in his act to the end of his career. As one critic noted, too harshly perhaps, Hogan pushed the darky characterization to the limits of unction and denigration. As a comedian, Hogan compares with minstrel performers such as Billy Kersands and Tom McIntosh more than with Bob Cole and Bert Williams. Hogan's great comic success was in the musical Rufus Rastus, but even there, it was the first act minstrel routine that critics praised. Like Kersands and McIntosh, Hogan seemed to have reacted to the minstrel parody of blacks by exaggerating and satirizing it. He made the white minstrel parody even more ridiculous, and thereby, in an ironic way, confirmed its absolute idiocy. But this subtle twist went unnoticed by most. For mainstream America, Hogan's act only confirmed blacks' presumed connection with the stage Negro. Hogan did, however, help establish the prototype for a kind of broad, mm, quintessentially low humor that, when stripped of its plantation overtones and given an urban trickster flavor by comics such as Flower Miller and Tim Moore, became a staple of the black theater circuit after 1920. Bob Cole's character, Wiley Wayside, like other tramp and drunken characters created by black comics of the period, slyly shifted the emphasis from the character's ethnic background to a conspicuous social problem. Tom McIntosh, generally a traditional blackface minstrel comic, also did a drunk routine in red-nosed makeup that occasionally allowed him to escape the confines of coonism. Cole, whose father was a prominent local politician in Atlanta, Georgia during the Reconstruction era, had attended college before striking out on his own as a musician, and his education partially accounts for the absence of the standard coon humor in his early comedy routines and his vaudeville act. As a monologuist, he often toned down the fractured English that characterized much low comedy. The Black Manhattan in 1930. James Weldon Johnson reaffirmed Cole's status among early black performers, calling him the greatest single force in the middle period of the development of the Negro in the American theater. He was the most versatile theatrical man the Negro has yet produced, a good singer and an excellent dancer, and able to play several musical instruments. He could write a dramatic or musical play, a dialogue, lyrics, and music, stage the play, and act the part. In his role as a tramp, he received the highest praise of the critics, and Cole died in 1931, and none of his work is currently available on film. But he remains one of the first black comedians who significantly, if subtly, altered traditional plantation humor on stage. As writers and performers, Flower Miller and Aubrey Lyles were primary forces in shaping the new urban black comic style. This new style was perhaps best typified later by the broad, audacious humor and flamboyance of Kingfish as portrayed by Tim Moore on the Amos and Andy television show in the 50s, a show for which Flower Miller wrote. With Hollywood sambo servant popularized through the performances of Steppin' Fetchin' in the 20s and the 30s, and the perennial black maid come earth mammy, this urban black common man would dominate black public humor until the 1960s. In 1908, Miller and Lyles began experimenting with two characters who, although similar to the familiar minstrel stereotype, had an assertiveness, an urban flair, and just enough trickster's cunning to set them apart. The pair appeared in several of Miller's and Lyle's early musicals and were popularized when they appeared as comic leads in Shuffle Along. In that show, however, perhaps as a concession to the largely white audience expected on Broadway, they were played primarily a stereotypical minstrel buffoons. Shortly afterwards, two white minstrel performers, Morin and Mack, billing themselves as the two Black Crows, became immensely popular. They were stars of vaudeville in the 20s and 30s, and were also featured in films and on radio. Both the characters and the dialect in their act were remarkably similar to Miller and Lyle's routine. Moran, that's a fine pair of shoes you was wearing there, my friend. Mac, yeah, I done cheated the store man out of them. Moran, how come? I seen you give him the check. Ain't the check no good? No how? Mac, sure, the check has got money behind it in the bank, but that man, he can't cash it. Moran, he can too. I saw you sign it. Sure, I signed it, big boy, but wait till that man get to the bank. I didn't fill in the amount. That's kind of dangerous. In fact, the similarity between the two sets of characters has led to claims and counterclaims as to who created them first. The controversy deepens because early 20th century literary humorists used similar dialect comedy, and the popular 20s radio show Amos and Andy also feature lines such as eyes regusted, regusted, and it all depends on the situation you was in, were more common in the routines of both teams. What is clear is that Miller and Lyles were experimenting with an urban black persona that differed ever so slightly, although not nearly enough from most middle class black critics, from the familiar plantation coon figure in both styles, assertiveness, and its authentic connection to black folklore. Their presentation of the type, if not assertedly their creation of it, influenced comedy on the black theater circuit for decades. Unfortunately, the proliferation of this comic figure on stage, screen, radio, and television provoked a dispute between black spokesmen and white producers, as well as among blacks themselves, that would simmer for years before erupting into the public controversy that saw the Amos and Andy television show withdraw from network airings in the 50s. Neither Miller nor Lyles sang or danced, so their stage act consisted primarily of conversation between the two characters. Lyles as the smaller, feistier, but more gullible one, Miller as the scheming city slicker who towered over his partner. In their vaudeville act, unlike Shuffle Along, they often avoided exaggerated minstrel coonery, using these characters to introduce routines that quickly became comic samples among black and white performers. Their usual stage interactions involved Lyle's character getting himself into situations that required courage and action far beyond his capabilities. His portrayal of the fiery, boastful little man who inevitably gets in over his head was the team's comic mainstay. From that, they evolved one of their most acclaimed routines, an acrobatic prize fighting bit in which Lyles takes the challenge of facing down his much larger partner as far as he dares before wisely fleeing. This pugilistic travesty, according to Henry Sampson, became a classic on the American stage. Their most famous and most imitated routine was the indefinite talk bit, introduced into their vaudeville act in the mid 20s. The setup is simple. Two characters begin talking to one another, but before either can finish a sentence, he is interrupted by the other. Variations on this routine are infinite, since the content of the dialogue is secondary to the comedian's timing and facial expressions. But performing with accurate timing, the routine remains a hilarious comic set piece. Among black audiences, it is as famous as Abbott and Costello's Who's On First. The following examples are from live performances by Nipsey Russell and Matt Moreland, a former partner of Miller's, who made the routine a specialty of his own act at the Apollo Theater in the 50s. So the language is not as fractured as it may have been when Miller and Lyles first performed the skit in the 20s. Who he gonna marry? He gonna marry the daughter of Mr. That's a nice girl. Let me tell you, I heard once. Nah, that was her sister. I'm keeping company with her. You are? Oh yeah. I've been with her now ever since. I didn't know you knew her that long. Sure. And I thought all the time she was. She was, but she cut him out. Well, I was talking to her father the other day, and the first thing, that was your fault. What you should have done was, I did. Or again, now I'm not calling out the names as I'm reading this. I mean, it don't have the names, it has the initials. And because I don't remember the names for which one, Moran, I think it is. Nipsey Russell and Moreland. Because I wasn't remembering their names, I'm not calling out their names. But I'll try. Moreland. How come you can't pay me now? Russell. Horse races. Moreland. What track you play at? Russell. I play over there at Moreland. The track's crooked. Why don't you play over here around? That's where, I'm going to just read. That's where I lost my money. Yeah. How much did you lose? I lost about, you don't have that much. Nah. No, all I had was about, shit, I had more than that. Really? Yeah. And you know what? I bet on the horse and that rascal didn't come in until, was he that far behind? Yeah. Who was the jockey riding him? A jockey by the name of, he can't ride. I thought he went out there to ride for, he did, but they fired him. He came on back. Oh, yeah? Sound like some brothers talking. In their writing as well as their performance of the prize fighting routine, the indefinite talk, and perhaps above all, in what they called muddling, the language you got to be prepared for that. You got to be prepared for that. Or I regusted. Eyes regusted. Yeah, I guess that's that old slave talk. Miller and Lyles exacted more influence on the transition of the Black American stage humor than any other performers in the early 20th century. Their so-called mutilating, their so-called mutilating of standard English replaced the imbecilic minstrel patter that previously had been the accepted common imitation of Black speech. It did not use a sage. Let's see what this is. I think I looked this word up before. ASS. Fuck. That's not the word. I gotta find it now. There you go. ASSUAGE. 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 Let's see how it's pronounced. ASSUAGE. I'll see. Assuage. Yeah, I wouldn't have got that. Assuage. Assuage. Make an unpleasant feeling or make less intense. The letter assuaged the fears of most members. It did not assuage or it did not make less intense the middle class critics like W.E.B. Du Bois. It did not assuage middle class critics like W.E.B. Du Bois, but it was more closely aligned with the way the average uneducated Black person spoke, and it represented a gigantic step towards a more respectable comic image. Miller's portrait of the city slicker added nuances of authenticity to minstrelsy's old Jim Dandy caricature by placing him in the context of the traditional Black trickster and altering his physical presentation in terms of gestures, attire, and manner of speech. In fact, Miller's intonation, which was closely replicated by Tim Moore as Kingfish, became the accepted way of affecting Black dialect by white and Black comedians until the 60s. And many white comedians, Robin Williams, for instance, still use an approximation of Miller's intonation when imitating blacks. Miller and Lyles continued writing and appearing in musical comedies and vaudeville throughout the 20s. When Aubrey Lyles died in 1932, Miller alternately teamed with Matman Moreland, best known as chauffeur and sidekick in the Charlie Chan film series, and Johnny Lee, who played Calhoun on the Amos and Andy show, and continued his stage career. In the late 30s, he moved to the West Coast, where he wrote and starred in numerous Hollywood and independently produced black films. In the 40s, he worked as a writer for the Amos and Andy show. When a television version was produced in 1951, he was instrumental in placing Tim Moore and his former partner, Johnny Lee, in key roles. Miller died in 1971, but his seminal position in the evolution of Black American stage humor is assured, and his contributions are still being felt. He not only fought for and insisted upon dignified treatment of Black performers, but created some of the funniest comedy sketches ever written or spoken. The character portrayed by George Walker was similar to Flower Noah Miller's trickster character and Tim Moore's portrayal of Kingfish on the Amos and Andy television show in the 1950s. Although Walker could not match the pure comic talent of Miller and Moore, he exceeded both in other ways. To conceive of Walker's effect, one must imagine Flower Noah Miller or Kingfish with an added dimension, the silken smoothness of a Fred Astaire, or more precisely, the grace and elegance of John Bubbles, the unparalleled black dancer who played the roles of Sporting Life in George Gerson's Porgy and Bess in 1935. The enthusiasm and flashy demeanor that Walker displayed on stage apparently reflected his personality away from the theater. Although he was the business mind behind the success of the Williams and Walker team, as well as a serious proponent of equal rights for blacks, Walker demonstrated the same zest and fun-loving nature in his personal life as he projected on stage. He enjoyed the wealth and acclaim to the full, often to the point of ostentation. He lived with the same verve with which he performed, relishing the adoration of the black community and generally ignoring the cold reception he experienced in the white world when the footlights dimmed. Bert Williams' portrayal of the ignorant darky on stage, on the other hand, was in complete contrast to his personal life. Williams was born in the Bahamas in 1876. His parents moved to the United States shortly afterward, and he grew up in Riverside, California, where he graduated from high school. The African American slave dialect that he used in his act was methodically practiced. Don't loaf round the corners on and pinned on the Lord for your daily bread. The Lord ain't running no bakery. As we was shuffling, slow-witted demeanor that his darky character projected, I must study his movements, Williams said of the character. He is not me. In fact, Williams was shy, almost obviously sensitive man who spent his spare time reading Night Switch and Mark Twain. The shiftless black-faced darky he portrayed with such perfection was entirely a stage creation, and the contradiction between the character he was forced to play in theater and his true nature largely accounts for the torment and aura of tragedy that marked his life. W.C. Fields, a vaudeville contemporary of Williams, called him a super-sensitive soul, and summing up the relationship between Williams' art and his life, said, Bert Williams is the funniest man I ever saw and the saddest man I ever knew. Much of that sadness derived from Williams' inability to adjust to the bias and consequent humiliations he faced as a black man in America, despite his stature as an entertainer. He occasionally told a story about two black comedians traveling in the South. who were confronted by a group of less than hospitable whites in a small town. The local inhabitants took exception to the dapper manner in which the entertainers were dressed. It's starting to sound like in life when they were trying to get them nigger pies. After the short interrogation, they decided to relieve the performers of their expensive attire, forcing them to strip and giving them burlap sacks. They ran them out of town. The unfortunate comedians, it turns out, were Williams and his partner George Walker, who were on their way to New York. The contradiction between being idolized on stage and scorned outside the theater nagged Williams throughout his life. The despair was such that toward the end of his career, he noticeably soured and began drinking heavily. But the agony of his personal life apparently did not affect his performances on stage. In his later years, he became an even more consummate comedian. Initially, Williams was confined to the role of a shiftless darky playing against Walker's prancing dandy. The tension and humor of their act flowed from the contrast. Williams' slow, cumbersome movement and speech set against Walker's radiance, agility, and silver-tongued conveyance. With Walker on stage, every move Williams made was magnified and intensified. His dim-witted darky literally wrenched laughter from the audience by the force of his inertia. In essence, he was playing a character that's steppin' fetchin', with which less finesse and insight would mythify through his broader exposure in films during the 20s and 30s. It was a standard caricature, distinguished only by the nuance and depth that Williams brought to the portrayal. Williams would come onto the stage in tattered clothes, shambling, ill at ease, a forlorn, wide-eyed expression on his face, which was corked to appear much darker than Walker's. Playing energy and intensity against laggardness, they would usually begin some routine patter in the dialect that was noticeably less fractured than that of Miller and Lyles, or white minstrels such as Moran and Mack. Inevitably, Walker preyed on Williams' naivety and supposed ignorance. Walker: I tells you I'm letting you in on this because you're a friend of mine. I could do this alone, but I want you to share in it because we's friends. Now, after you gets into the bank, you fill that satchel with money. Williams: whose money? Walker: that ain't the point. We don't know who put the money in there, and we don't know why they got it. And they won't know why we got it. All we have to do is put the money in the satchel. I'll get you the satchel. Ain't nothing to bother about. That's because you're a friend of mine, see? Williams: and what do I do with this satchel? Walker: all you get to do is bring it to me at the place where I tells you. Williams: when they come to count up the cash and finds it short, then what? Walker: by that time, we'll be far, far away, where the birds is singing and the flowers is in bloom. Williams: and if they catch us, they'll put us so far, far away, we'll never hear no birds singing. Everybody knows you can't smell no flowers through a stone wall. This type of interchange might be followed by Williams singing one of his songs that made him famous. Nobody or Jonah Man. My luck started when I was born, and Leah's so the old folks say. That same hard luck has been my best friend to this very day. Invariably, the act would end with the cakewalk, in which Walker's grace and vitality was the perfect foil for Williams' dawdling, hesitant maneuvers. In content, the act was not innovative, but Walker's flourish and Williams' genius for understatement and for projecting the feelings of the perennial underdog, gave their routine a dimension that no other comedy team working similar material could match. Bandanaland was the last of Williams and Walker's musical. George Walker became seriously ill during the run and was forced to seek I looked this up now. Convalescence at the health resort. He died in 1911 at the age of 37. Williams sought no permanent replacement for his partner. He performed one more Broadway show, Mr. Load of Coal, which opened in 1909 and closed in December of the same year. For the remainder of his career, he performed primarily as a single act in vaudeville and the Ziegfeld Follies. Without Walker, Williams was forced to dig even deeper to project the pathos and humor of his character. All the jokes in the world are based on a few elemental ideas, and this is one of them. The sight of other people in trouble is nearly always funny, he wrote in 1918. I am the Jonah man, the man who, even if it rained soup, would be found with a fork in his hand and no spoon in sight. The man whose fighting relatives come to visit him and whose head is always dented by the furniture they throw at each other. Williams took this element aspect of humor and studied it, polishing and molding it until he was able to transcend the shiftless caricature through which his humor emerged. Being black in America, as Williams said, was inconvenient, so much so that when Florence Ziegfeld first composed that Williams joined the Follies, most of the white performers threatened to quit or boycott the show. Ziegfeld resisted their demands, and out of loyalty, Williams remained even though he could have made twice as much money in vaudeville. Still, in his contract with Ziegfeld, he insisted on a clause stipulating that no female performers would appear on stage with him. He did not want to incite audiences with even the hint of fraternization with the white female entertainer. In return, Ziegfeld agreed that the Follies would make no southern tour when Williams was performing. And on one occasion, in 1919, Williams went to the theater and began his usual routine of dressing and applying makeup. When he left his dressing room, however, he found the stage dim and the theater empty. A strike had been called by Actors' Equity, but no one had bothered to tell him. Even though he was the star of the Ziegfeld Follies, he was barred from the union. Williams' act consisted of songs, stories, and most importantly, pantomime. Most of the songs, like Nobody and Jonah Man, had been part of his routine with Walker, but many of the stories and the pantomime routines were created for his single act. His ghost stories were practically poignant, because they frequently incorporated a subtle common sense factor that was missing in most scary nigger tales. In one, he told of having to cross the graveyard to get home one night. Seeing a ghost, he started running. When he got to the street, he looked around and, not seeing anything follow him, sat down on the curb. But a moment later, he sees something out of the corner of his eye and turns to find the ghost sitting next to him. The ghost says, "That was a fine run we had." "It was the best running I've ever saw," I says. "Yes, and soon as I get my breath, we're going to see some more." Williams' anecdotes sometimes echoed standard vaudeville humor, or turned on the stage Negro's ignorance. When an old lady is injured in a railway accident, someone urges her to sue for damages. "Lord knows I done got enough damages," she said. "What I'm going to sue for is repairs." Or, after looking up and down the bill of fare without enthusiasm, a guest finally decided on a dozen fried oysters. The colored waiter became all apologies. "I's very sorry, sir, very sorry, but we's all out of 'em all shellfish. More often, however, he transcended those limitations, venturing into the kind of wit for which Will Rogers was best known. The character and I try to portray, Williams said, is the shiftless darky to the fullest extent. His fun, his philosophy. Show this artless darky a book, and he won't know what it's all about. He can't read, he cannot write, but ask him a question, and he'll answer it with a philosophy that's got something. Scattered throughout the monologues were sage tidbits that mirrored not only his view of the world, but the viewpoint of the blacks that he so methodically observed. Williams' dim-witted character could observe that mankind ain't neither as good as he says he is, nor as bad as they makes out to be. Or some folks shows them most liberality when they ain't got nothing, and warm that any time you commences to get the big head, you ought to stop and think about all the great men what's died and about how well they were got along without them. He could also be assertive or defiant, as when he sang. We all heard about the straw that broke the camel's back. Well, a bubble added to my load would surely make mine crack. But believe me, woe be to he or she who tries to ease me that bubble. Believe you me. But it was through pantomime that Williams truly released his comic genius. After Walker's death, mime became a more important part of his routine. And it was largely because of this shift in emphasis that he emerged as an even greater comedian. He studied with the French mime Pietro while Walker was ill, and that experience, he said, taught me that the entire aim of art in the theater was to achieve simplicity. Throughout the second half of his career, understatement and simplicity were key elements in his performances. Through pantomime, Williams was able to completely eliminate minstrel dialect and low comedy associated with it in much of his act. This freed him to focus his creative energy on nuances of movement and facial expressions that belied the darky caricature he presented, to employ the subtle facial work that the comic actor Robert Gilliam has called mumbling on the face. According to most critics, among performers on the popular stage, he was matchless. His poker game pantomime, which according to Tom Fletcher was inspired by observing a psychotic patient in a hospital, is considered a classic stage routine, as were the mime bits he interspersed with his vocal rendition of Nobody. There's enough evidence to suggest that Bert Williams was one of the best comedians of all time, and certainly the best of his own time. Critics and peers, despite the flagrant bias of the era, readily recognized his ascendancy. For instance, in A View of Bandana Land, the mainstream New York critic wrote that Williams and Walker stood in the very forefront of the American stage, if not all alone in the forefront, and asserted that it is the single justice to say that our stage has no white comedian as good as Bert Williams. Flo Ziegfeld, after Williams' death, wrote that he was one of the greatest comedians I ever employed. In fact, he was one of the greatest in the world. Eddie Cantor, who, like W.C. Fields, played on the same bill with Williams, said, whatever sense of timing I have, I learned from him. And in an article published after Williams' death, Cantor wrote, he knew each mental attitude of his own race and its humorous reactions to every situation. He was far superior to any of us who put on burnt cork. Williams' achievements were such that Booker T. Washington commented that he had done more for the Negro race than any other black of the period. He was instrumental in breaking down barriers for blacks in vaudeville and on the Broadway stage. He was the first black performer to star in a motion picture. The 1901 recordings that he had and George Walker made of songs from popular black musicals are the earliest documented instance of blacks on phonograph records. And when he died, at the height of his career in March of 1922, he was the highest paid performer in the Ziegfeld Follies. Perhaps more important, Williams demonstrated that even the most denigrative stereotype could be invested with dignity. His comic genius permitted him to humanize the debased caricature that white minstrels had created and black minstrels had perpetuated. So the efforts of Bob Cole, Flower Miller, and George Walker, he did not merely cover the stereotype with a veneer of black style, he turned it inside out to reveal the humanity beneath the cynical distortion. In so doing, he achieved the goal that black comedians would struggle to repeat for decades. For Williams's genius made the path he took almost impossible to follow. For years between 1890 and 1921 saw many advances for black entertainers in the acceptance of black folk or syncopated music, in the wider acceptance of blacks in vaudeville and on Broadway, and in the growth of independently produced black shows. But in comedy, the changes were more cosmetic than meaningful. Blackface still thrived, and although elements of black style and restricted aspects of the trickster motif had been added to the comic stage caricature, the face of Sambo persisted. Given the circumstances at the turn of the century, however, Hogan, Cole, Miller, and Walker had done nearly as much as was possible to invest the stage Sambo with elements of black style and authentic folkways. Williams's genius was noted, but during the early 20th century, Hollywood nearly eradicated all the advances made by introducing a host of celluloid stereotypes. In the public domain, humanizing minstrel stereotypes would be confined to black theaters, the Theater Owners Booking Association, and the so-called Chitlin Circuit. And the private humor of blacks would begin to shift dramatically from its southern folk base to a hyper, more assertive, and caustic urban style. And that was the end of section 3 and chapter 4, which was vaudeville and black humor of On the Real Side by Mr. Mel Watkins, a history of African American comedy from slavery to Chris Rock. I think I did all right. I stumbled over some words, but for the most part, I think I did pretty good tonight. We read it in under an hour. And we out of chapter 4. Lord willing, we'll come back next time with chapter 5, Hollywood's Silent Years, The Curse of a Nation. And if you don't know, that's them boys. That could have been your doctor, your dentist, your store clerk, your baker. It could have been anybody underneath that mask trying to send you to your makeup. Yeah. But yeah, that was then we're moving along. We starting to I can see the growth as the chapters go on. I can definitely see the growth in the people I know. You know, it's starting to get to my time and, you know, places and words like the Chitlin Circuit. You know, that's something I've heard of multiple times. I've heard multiple comedians talk about, you know, having to do the Chitlin Circuit and how bad it was. You know, the things that they dealt with the producers. You know, there's still a lot of things that people still deal with today. You know, you got from I think some people call them the 360 deals and stuff like that. You got a lot of deals that a lot of entertainers, whether it be musical entertainers or comedians, you know, probably even writers, probably even writers, from book writers to script writers. It's probably a lot of the same stuff that they still deal with today. Being that we don't really own these industries, we just are in them to try to help ourselves, further ourselves along financially, to get by, to build up our ego, or whatever, because we want to be. You talk about that some people want it to just be known. And in today's society, when you have, things such as YouTube, TikTok, and all that stuff, everybody seems to want their 15 minutes of fame. Whether it's for more so for a person's own personal gain, but not necessarily, you don't have as many people, even though you have them. It's just not as many people who are trying to do things to help better the position of their people, as can be said about some of these guys. Some of the first black comedians, as we just read, who they said did more for the Negroes than anybody did, at that time period. The question would be who in, I guess, in our entertainment circle is doing things for the advancement of our people, as some have done in this book. Yeah, I don't know any right off. I mean, it's probably something I could think about if I sit back and think about it. I don't know any right off. And what exactly would be the examples of what they have done to progress us or move us forward, you know, or even move things forward in whatever, in their respective fields and whatever they're doing, whether it be music or comedy, reading. Who is trying to push the bill forward. But we'll come back with and start chapter 5. I think chapter 5 also has 3 sections. Shit, man. Section 1 is only 3 pages. I kind of want to get started on it right now, honestly. Section 2 is 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 pages. We'll probably come back tomorrow and start chapter. Man, we're gonna read all of chapter 5 tomorrow. It's not that long. It'll probably be an hour and a half. Hour and a half read. Hour and a half read for all of chapter 5, section 1, 2, and 3. I think we can get it in, man. I think I can get that. We still got a long way to go, though, man. Still got a long way to go. It maybe seem like it's moving kind of slow, but to me, I think I'm moving pretty good. I need to keep a consistent pace, but hey, for the most part, we're moving pretty good. I'm trying to see what's the last chapter. So it has 13 chapters in the book. 13 chapters. We are moving into chapter 5. And I'm going to read all chapter 5 tomorrow. I'm going to push that. Man, we're moving along. We're moving along. But that's that. If you have any, make sure you leave the comments and things of that nature. Like, comment, subscribe if you're not subscribed. Welcome back to all the old folks, and welcome to all the new folks. If you're coming in late, whenever you catch it, good night, good morning, good afternoon, whatever it may be. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope that it's something that you have grasped from the reading, something that maybe you didn't know before, something that maybe caught your mind. Maybe, man, hey, put it in the comments. It might be something that might have slipped past me. But one page at a time, one section at a time, one chapter at a time, until we finish the whole book. And we're gonna keep pushing and keep pushing and keep pushing and keep pushing and see what else we can put up in here. What else can we download into the mental memory banks? And on to the next book. But that'll be that. That'll be it for tonight. Yeah, I've read Babylon from Babylon to Timbuktu in uh prior videos. So you have to go back. You have to go back through the lives. You have to go back through the lives and catch it. I have read it. I have read multiple books by Mr. Rudolph Windsor. And actually, this is my signed copy from Mr. Rudolph Windsor. So I read From Babylon to Timbuktu, The Valley of the Dry Bones, and I have also read Barack and Deborah United by Mr. Rudolph Windsor. Well, this is a duo by his wife and himself, by Mary and Dr. Rudolph Windsor. So I've read all three of his books. They are all in the previous videos. So feel free to check them out at your leisure. And some of the stuff I have to go back and check. I might have to redo a couple, not these, but I know in the book of Jasher. Hold on. So the book of Jasher I read as well, but I know this one specifically. I know that some of the videos or some of the lives didn't make it or didn't go all the way through for whatever reason. So I'm gonna probably end up having to go back and read this one along with some of Miss Sherazad Ali's books. It's either this one or The Black Woman's Guide to Understanding the Black Man. I think it might be like one chapter. I think, I read a couple of comments that said that it was missing a chapter. So I'll probably go back, once I have the time, once I get through, because right now I'm going to focus on this one. But once I, get through, I'll probably go back and redo some of, the chapters that I made. Once I'll scan my videos. There's over 300 and some videos, should be. So it's plenty of videos. Now don't get me wrong. The other ones I read were at the beginning of my reading journey, I should say. So the readings might not be as good as they are now. I think I've grown a lot since reading these. They're definitely good books. Definitely good books by Miss Sherazad Ali, and definitely good books by Mr. Dr. Rudolph R. Windsor. Definitely good books by him. So, but if I do have to go back and read them again, hey, it's not an issue. We'll make it happen. Just another day, another time. The same way, just like the Bible say, line upon line. We'll read it through here a little, there a little, baby. But we'll read through as many books as I can. As many books, as I have right now. The objective is to get through the books that I have on the shelf. and over there, just so I can be able to say, part of it to be able to say I've read about everything up here, and to put my brick in because maybe some people have a harder time reading for themselves. I know I did, so hopefully the journey of bettering myself and trying to advance my reading skills, uh, word pronunciation, understanding, can be seen and maybe it can help somebody else to do the same in their life. Because for me, I never was an avid reader, but later on in my life, I definitely have wanted to become more of an avid reader. And, it's definitely something, an example for the children as well as my children to see. I think, over the years, the children imitate the things that they see from their parents. So, for my children who aren't with me, they could catch me on YouTube. And for the children who are with me, they could see me reading on the regular. So it'll make them want to pick up a book. And it does. So we'll keep pushing though. One page at a time, one section at a time, one chapter at a time, until we get it right. And hopefully, once again, it's something that we all can learn and grow from. It's something that we all can, maybe it might be a little bit here and a little bit there, but it might be something. Whatever it is that you can take from any of these books and apply them to your life to maybe help you understand, maybe help guide you, maybe help you get the picture. Maybe, some of the struggles that you may read or may hear read in these books, you may examine them upon your struggles to see that your struggles ain't shit. And if they could do it, then you can do it. Look how the Most High guided them, through their things. You may be able to be guided the same way, if not better. Who knows what your purpose may be? It may be something that you hear, in one of the readings can help you forward motion to where you're supposed to be and what you're supposed to be doing and better yourself. But yeah, we'll keep pushing. We shall keep pushing. And I got quite a few books, man. I got quite a lot of books that I have not read. I just be when it comes to these big books. Oh Lord. The big books have me. It's like Goliath. I'm gonna knock him down. Hit him with the rock. Knock his ass down. But it take a little time. It take a little time and a little practice. A little time, a little practice. It is what it is. But I appreciate you stopping by. I hope that you are able to catch other lives, hopefully. And as well as I hope you find the reading of the books that you are looking for. Yeah. But until next time, man. Shalom, everybody. SHILO out. I hope y'all have a nice one.